And I know that I get the distinct pleasure of having the longest session of the day and the one immediately following lunch. So everyone is going to be in food coma. So I'm aware of that. So if I get a little bit slap happy or silly, consider it me trying to keep you awake. All right. So for this session, we're gonna run this one a little bit differently. So in this session, you're going to use your clickers quite a bit. So make sure you have them at the ready. And what we're going to do in this session, we call it our protocol review. So let me frame that for you briefly. We are going to look at a totally make-believe protocol, but know that when you start looking at that in a couple of minutes, or in just a minute now, it's not going to be a total packet. Like, it's not like I'm actually handing you a full packet that you would actually get from your researcher. So what you have is a short version of a protocol that is completely hypothetical, made up by us, that we're going to go through. We're not going to go through every step of an IRB review because we don't have time to do that, nor the will. You guys do that regularly. But we're going to use that process to draw out some points with the regulations, questions. We'll use it to review, tackle some of your questions. I'll put questions out for you to address. So we're going to use that as the basis of our talk now. Okay? So I'm going to make you guys do a lot of this work. So, all right. So to start that off, does everyone have a copy in front of you of our mock protocol? It should start with what looks like a form, an exemption form. If you still need one, please raise your hand. Let me know if you need one. I need a couple on the front table up here. Tamana, thank you so much. All right, I'm going to give you 5 to 10 minutes to read this. So your first job is to read that. I'm going to turn off my mic and let you go, and I'll bring you back in a little bit. Go. Okay, I think most people have had a chance to get to the end of the protocol. And I don't want to start losing you, although I have to say, of the different workshops and presentations I did, you guys are the most, I think, attentive. There's like no little conversation starting along the way. I'm kind of impressed. You're like a dream class from my teaching days. Okay, now what we're going to do is that we're going to take that protocol that you just read, and we're going to review it using the pre-2018 rule. So we're going to evaluate this using the current rule. Okay? We're going to work through this a little bit step by step and handle some questions and bring up some discussion. And then at the end, we'll talk about we'll raise a few issues with the revised rule and how we might look at it differently in light of the revised rule. Okay? And we won't get into an in-depth discussion of that because there's so much with the revised rule still being new and guidances that are still being developed and that sort of thing. So we won't go into, and we won't dig into that deeply, but we will raise it. So to kind of start pointing out and to use some of the things that you've been learning today about the revised rule as well. But we're going to use this now to start talking through the process and to review some important points. So you've had a chance to read the protocol that we're going to talk about, and you're going to say we use this a lot. This flow chart, we use it a lot because, and as Angela said, we bring it up in our discussions in our office. When people send in tough questions and we sit down and start hammering through them, we do the same process because it anchors us all in the same place. We're always starting with the same thing. And the first question is always for us, do our regulations even apply? Right? So we're going to do that now. We're just going to keep modeling that through. So, okay, so is it research? Based on what you just read, does this seem to be a systematic investigation that is designed to contribute to or develop generalizable knowledge? Can we all agree that yes, it meets that regulatory criterion? So I'm going to go through that. I'm just going to breeze by that pretty quickly. Yes, this constitutes research under the regulatory definition. Okay, so then we move down to the next question. Does it involve human subjects? Yes. Show me. Use your clickers. Unless you're just feeling really confident and you want to make this identifiable, in which case we can. But no, let's stick with the clickers because they're going to get harder. Waiting for a few more people to decide, or did I lose people at lunch? I think so. We might have lost a few people. Okay. All right. Then I'll go ahead and close it out. And we have huge agreement here that yes, in fact, this does involve human subjects. And yes, it does. Otherwise, this would be a really short session, wouldn't it? All right. So yeah, that might have been a little bit of a gimme. So just as a quick review, of course, Angela has already been through this definition with you, where we consider a human subject to be a living individual about whom an investigator obtains data through intervention or interaction or identifiable private information. So talking kind of specifically about this. So point this out for me. You guys tell me. Is anyone willing to speak up and tell me about these points in this protocol? Call it out for me. Are these all living individuals? Let's start there. Yeah, okay, we can agree with that. All right. And are we collecting data about whom? Does this meet the about whom standard? Yes. Why?
Answering questions through the survey.
Answering questions through the survey? And what kind of answers are they specifically giving that reaches this about whom?
Themselves.
It's about themselves, right? They're giving their perspectives, their opinions. Excellent. Okay, very good. And what about this whole intervention or interaction thing? What are we meeting that criterion?
Group discussions.
Yeah, we've got group discussions, right, in the focus group. We've got what?
I think it's an intervention because they created the platform for the discussion. It wasn't a platform that was pre-existing.
Okay, good. It was the online discussion forum is something that was created for the research. It's not an open public forum that already exists out there, right? It's a closed space. Okay, so absolutely the survey would also be an interaction, right?
Yeah.
Anything else to add to that at the moment? The demographic. What about the demographics? They're providing it. They're providing demographics. Okay. So specifically, that would lead to which point in the definition? What are you raising when you bring up demographics?
In this definition, data and identifiable information.
So the identifiable. So we have an issue here about identifiable. Now, what do the investigators put forward about this? What do they say about it in the protocol?
They give a false name.
What do they say about identifiable information? Do they? They mention it?
Fake names.
No names, right? Fake names in the discussion, right? Where they talk about that, absolutely. In the focus groups, they're asked to use fake names.
It says the students will not be asked to provide any personally identifiable information.
Exactly. They specifically say that the students will not be asked to provide identifiable information. Their private information. So does everyone feel comfortable that is met, that this is not identifiable?
I have a question because one of the survey questions asks them to identify themselves if they're in an athletic club, membership in a sorority or
I'm going to ask you to do this on mic so everyone can hear it because I think this is an important point.
I have a concern about when they ask on the survey if they're affiliated with a sorority or a fraternity or something like that. It's or academic class. That can
Ooh, feedback. Sorry.
that can qualify them as being identifiable to some sort. I mean, if you're in a small group college, that you can find out.
Absolutely. So I agree with that. So while they're not specifically asked questions to provide identifying information, and this is where the IRB review is super duper important, right? It depends on the context, where this is happening, how big of a group is this, and how these different factors come together. If you're talking about a small, in this case, campus, right? We're talking about a sample of 2,000 students-ish. That's not a big campus. Right? And then you're narrowing it down based on membership, Greek life, athletic club. They're asking for, for sexual orientation, relationship, things like that, right? When you put these things together, in some contexts, you're creating a potentially identifiable situation. Now, in other contexts, if you're talking about, say, an urban campus in the middle of New York City, when it's a big, school with thousands and thousands of kids, right? It probably would not be identifiable. But again, this is context driven. So I'm glad to see that raised. So that's the sort of thing that the IRB really has to look at. the situation in which the research is being conducted is very important, right? And so the IRB should be attuned to that. So I'm really glad you raised that. So that's unclear here, okay, in this protocol. So keeping that in the back of your minds here. I think we've hit these definitions pretty clearly here. We've talked about what an intervention is, and we've talked about what an interaction is, what private information is, and what it means to be individually identifiable. It's kind of what we were just talking about. Private information I'll raise just because it'll come up a little bit in this talk later. It kind of gets at here, it's what an individual can reasonably expect would not be made public. So some, easy examples of this would be like your medical record. That would be private information. This has come up in some of the questions earlier in the day. And that's not what we're talking about in this protocol. However, that expectation of something not being made public, that's an important part here. And it will come up again as we go through this protocol again, because while these students are being asked to, say in the focus group, to use a fake name, right? That's great. However, even using a fake name, whatever they say to the group, and this is something that's being recorded as it identifies in this protocol, right? So is something, that the subject in this case has the power to take something that would be considered private and possibly put it out there as no longer private, thinking they're protected by a fake name. Okay, so I think that there are some lines here, and there's a little bit of fuzziness in this protocol that will be important for us to kind of keep in mind. So, okay, you guys all agreed that not only is this research, but it also definitely is human subjects research. So we move on to the next question in our step: is this exempt? So just a reminder that we're going by current rule, so don't worry about 1 through 8. We're sticking solidly in the 1 through 6 realm, okay? And I'll put this out there. Just a quick response poll. Would this be considered exempt? Human subjects research under the regulations. Tell me what you think. I'm stubborn and I'm determined to get to at least 35. Who's still out there? Give me your vote, please. All right. You outlasted me. All right, you guys, about 75% of you feel that no, this would not be exempt. And about 25% of you think yes, it might be exempt. Okay. So I'm not going to give you a correct answer here. I wanted to know your opinions. If you were looking at an exemption for this, what exemption would you be looking at? What would you be? Which one would you be considering? I'll give you a hint. Look at the cover page of your. I'm giving you this is a leading question. There, number 2, right? So we're talking surveys and interviews here, right? So we're talking about what we're really going to focus on now is going to be Exemption 2, where this isn't an educational test clearly, but we're talking surveys, interviews, that sort of thing. Okay, so let's remember Exemption 2, current Exemption 2 briefly. I know we've been bouncing you back and forth quite a bit today. All right, educational tests, surveys, interviews, or observation of public behavior, unless it's identifiable and any disclosure could put the subject at risk of liability, either criminal or civil liability, financial, employment, or reputational harm. So I kind of leveled those all out for you there. Remembering this does not apply to children. The protocol did acknowledge you had to be over 18 in this particular case. Although let me point out really briefly that 18 is not written in the regulations anywhere. Okay, so let me just remind you that is based on, that's a local thing, that's a state law. The determining when a minor becomes an adult is not set in the federal regulations. So just putting that out there. So while this protocol hit it as 18 as if this location would be that way, and we'll use that for this example because that's not the purpose of our example today. I just giving you that reminder. Okay, so this is Exemption 2, the one that we're thinking about. And also just to point out the quick little difference here, when we talked about the new version of this exemption in the revised rule, notice that the and that's in red changed to an or. And then there was the third or, right? So I'm just going to also raise that for you. But for the current rules, this is an and, okay? So it can be exempt unless it is both identifiable and could cause harm. Okay, so that's where we are for the current rule and so for this exercise. So it involves surveys and interviews. Okay, in this case, the interviews are focus groups, right? But that still counts as an interview kind of situation. So we seem to meet that. And what about interventions? Talk to me about interventions. Is there an intervention here, or are we just talking about the survey and the focus group interview, which falls under that here? Is there an intervention? No. I'm sorry, what? Videos? So are the videos an intervention? What do you guys think?
No, not because it's a survey, not it's an interaction.
It's an interaction.
Part of the interaction.
It's part of the survey. I'm going to ask you to look back at that part. Look at that part of the text real quick for me here. I want to dig into this point a little bit here. Looking at the description. So I'm in the third paragraph under description of the intervention.
So they're looking at
Angela, I'm going to ask you to bring the mic up here so that she can speak to the group, please. Well, let me jump in here. Let's do it together. Go ahead.
Well, they're asked to provide their thoughts about certain encounters, and then they're shown videos to see if the videos change their perception of whether certain instances would be considered sexual assault.
And so based on that, your conclusion is that
That's it.
that's an intervention. Do you want to add to it?
That's what I was going to say.
As you're going to say, that's exactly, and very so I'm glad that this point came up. I want to make a differentiation here because it is possible, right, if you're doing a survey, to have a video be part of it and have it literally be part of the survey, which is I think the point that a few of you were making. So say it's a matter of it's just part of the survey. It's what information do you glean from this video sort of thing. That can absolutely be part of a survey that is exemptable. However, what sets this apart in this example is exactly what these two ladies just raised for us, and that is that you answer these questions, you give your responses to what is described in prose, essentially, these situations that are described in words, and you answer, do you feel like this is sexual harassment? Do you feel like it would be sexual assault? How would you evaluate the situation? And then you watch them in these videos. You watch an enactment of it. So you see two people interacting in this way, and then they have you answer the same questions again to see if it changes your responses. That is what makes this an intervention. That's a really, really good, that's an important point and a good catch. So the fact that there's a video in there itself isn't what makes it happen. Yes, ma'am.
What if it's not intended to be an intervention, just to be part of the survey?
So I think if it were intended to be just part of the survey, then there would not be a reason to ask the same questions before and after. It might, if it were part of the survey, so what might happen is that you would do one or the other. You would either do the written part and do the survey questions and then watch the videos, or watch the videos and then give your responses.
What if it's to determine if written? This is to me is designed to provide an intervention. So what if it's written to the written? They're doing the written portion to see the reaction to that, and the video to see their reaction to that. Mm-hmm. In order to design an intervention.
I think that's an excellent point. So I think if they were looking at there's the written part and how do you react, then there's the video part and how do you react, and the goal is to design an intervention. So, and I think, and in some ways this is similar because the goal of all of this, from it says in the beginning, is that they want to develop materials about this whole bystander effect, right? And that's for down the road after the research. But I think that the difference here, the only thing that makes the difference here is the fact that it actually says in here, where's the word? To where does it say it? To ascertain whether witnessing these events impacts their answers. So I think that what you're describing is absolutely something that a researcher might do. But in this case, they've actually said to see if it affects the answers of the survey participants. So I think that's the only thing that actually specifies it here. I think that would actually be a slightly different, the answer might be different, because that would be a slightly different situation. But in this case, what the researcher has indicated, the pretend investigator, has indicated is that they're looking to see if the answers change based on viewing the videos. Does that make sense? It's a subtlety.
Yeah, but it's still, if that's not their intention. I mean, if they're trying to find out what the best intervention would be, and that is determined by if an intervention is made during the study, is that what you're saying?
So I think I think there are two different parts there. I think this is an intervention in this hypothetical study.
Yes.
And I think that the goal of this study is to gather information about the perspectives and viewpoints of potential bystanders, right, of current college-age students, to gather more information about that in order to eventually develop, perhaps interventions that they could use to help students and make campuses safer, arguably. But it doesn't, so the purpose of the research is to gather all of this information to then start developing what would not be necessarily research interventions, but would be student interventions.
So regardless of what the intent was, an intervention did occur.
So in this case, yes.
Okay.
The video combined with the survey in the way that it is here, the video survey, with the intent to ascertain whether the video impacted their answers. That's what makes this an intervention.
Okay.
So in this particular case, we have both going on. And you have already raised the point that as far as identifiable, this is potentially identifiable. Okay, it's clear that the researchers don't intend it to be. They're purposely not collecting what the very obvious identifiable information. They're asking for false names. But it might be the case that they're either not thinking about this all the way through, that it might still be potentially identifiable, or that they just haven't provided all of the information to the IRB. Those are both possible. And so could this now, what about the second point here? Could disclosure of any information here from anything in the study, so this goes from surveys through the focus group, could disclosure of any of this information potentially put subjects at some sort of risk of harm? Yes, for example. What kind of harms?
Reputational harm.
Reputational harms.
Probing real examples that they want them to give during those discussion groups.
Absolutely, real examples. And they're being asked not to use real names, but they could. They might slip.
I think
What else?
The smaller, like you said before, if it's a smaller university, that might happen. But if it's a large university and you get a larger population that's answering.
That's an excellent point. If it's a small university and someone starts talking about a real life thing that just happened last semester, the chances on a small campus that people will know who that is, who was the victim, who was the perpetrator, how it all fell out, if it's even been decided yet, right? And so I think absolutely that could be completely identifiable. Well, my roommate did this. This isn't a real name, but right? Absolutely. Okay? So we have things like that. We have, other things when you talk about this. If you've got, so say you have, in this case, adults, 19-year-olds talking about this situation. It was a real life situation, and so was using these drugs or was really, really drunk. But wait a minute, you're 19 years old, and we now have a legal question. Could you be and have a legal liability issue here? You could. Okay? So is there the potential that disclosure of information that could be identifiable could cause harm? Yes, I think that's right. Okay, and we're not too far into the what if game here. We're not too far down a rabbit hole. This is pretty reasonable.
After Penn State, people took a look at their child abuse, neglect, and reporting. So in the state of Nebraska, everyone has an obligation to report, and so all of our human subjects research, where you had to relate.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Any of the human subjects research where you had to relate potential assault or that kind of thing, neglect, that risk was always listed.
Absolutely.
You tell them you have an affirmative duty to report it.
Yes, and that's another thing that's not raised here, and that's that there might be a duty to report. if you could be a danger to yourself or others, or there was perhaps something criminal that does come out, that there might be an affirmative duty.
And then the incidental findings with Title IX for the university as well.
Absolutely. Yes. So I think those are some excellent points. So I'm going to ask this one again. What do you think? Is this exempt human subject research? That's a long answer to a short question, right? Just watching the number tick up. All right, I'll go ahead and close it. And I think that we all agree now that no, this subject would not be. Look at that. Woo, unanimity. Okay, so we've worked our way through the first three decision points in our flow chart here. It is research, it involves human subjects, it is not exempt, we've determined, and so on it goes to IRB review. Okay, fantastic. Your next question. This one is not for the investigator, this is for you, right? For the IRB, because the investigator doesn't get to decide this. So, would you review this expedited or full board? So this is the next thing that we're going to talk about. So here's your first question. An expedited review is so called because the criteria for approval are simpler, and hence the review will also take less time. Who doesn't like to expedite?
Yeah, but they put that caveat, is it simpler? They always say no. It's not always simpler. It doesn't always take less time. See it.
Okay, anyone else want to weigh in? Waiting on a few. A few reticent button pushers. All right. The majority of you say that this is false. And you would be correct. All right. Expedited review does not mean that the criterion are simpler or any different. In fact, as we know, the criterion for approval are exactly the same. Right? Whether it's expedited review or full board review, the same requirements must be met in order to be approved. So there is, of course, the Secretary's list of expeditable research, and this is in. And if you hadn't wanted to look at it, don't worry about this right here. You have it in front of you. It's like the very last page of that booklet. And there are actually 9. Right? There are 9 categories, but 7 of them pertain to initial review. And that's these 7, because we're talking about initial review. 8 and 9 have to do with continuing review. And so in order to be expeditable, which, by the way, is not a word, and Microsoft Word hates it, and we write it a lot, and so we get lots of red squigglies. In order to be expeditable, it's got to be on one of these categories. The procedures in the research has to fit in here somewhere. Okay, and so I've giving you a very leading hint here. I bolded one of them. So this might very well fit under expeditable category 7. Okay, research on individual group characteristics or behavior, employing survey, interview, oral history, focus group, program evaluation, etc. So does it seem to meet that criteria? It does. It might fit under there. We can talk about details later, but yeah, it seems to, and generally that might apply here. Here's your next clicker question. A study that involves only the procedures listed on the Secretary's list, and they can fall under one or more of those categories, can automatically be reviewed using the expedited review process. True or false? Okay, let's see what you guys say. All right, 72% say this is false. 28% say it is true. I agree that it is false. Who can tell me why? Go ahead, Jyoti.
Depends on the risk.
What about the risk?
It has to be minimal risk.
Aha, absolutely. There is a second requirement. So the procedures and the research have to be found on that list, on the Secretary's list, and it has to be no more than minimal risk. Absolutely. Okay, so this, in the current rule, the IRB has to make this determination, has to actively make this determination. Both criterion must be met in order for it to be reviewed in an expeditable fashion. So that begs the next question. I bet you can predict what it's going to be. Right? Is this research no more than minimal risk? You tell me. These are written, I apologize. So yes, the research is no more than minimal risk. Or no, the research is more than minimal risk. Or C, I'm just unsure. I'll give you an easy way out there. All right, let's see what you say. Okay, 26% say yes, the research is no more than minimal risk. 68% says no, it is more than minimal risk. And 6% are unsure. Okay, I'm going to let that stay there for a minute. I'm not going to answer the question just yet. So let's talk a little bit more about it. Okay, let's think about this. So, making a minimal risk determination. Okay, let's remember the definition of minimal risk in the regulations, right? It's the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of a routine physical or psychological examination or test. Okay, so what you have to do in making this determination as the IRB is to first identify the risks, right? So we've got to look at this and we've got to figure out what are those risks going to be. Okay, that could reasonably result from the research. Okay, yes?
Recounting sexual assault that they may have personally seen may bring about emotional distress for that research subject.
Absolutely. So she points out, in case you couldn't hear it over here, that that recounting a sexual assault situation could bring on emotional distress if it brings up a memory for someone, right? Now, let me ask you this. Do the investigators try to deal with this at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
How?
Because if you have that in your past, then you wouldn't be able to participate.
Exactly. Yes.
The problem is they ask for them to recite events that have happened that they know about, and that's the disclosure of information that normally there's a lot of legal boundaries and everything else too.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got a couple of risks. So they do. The researchers try to get away from this, like bringing up personal experience, trauma kind of a thing. So they essentially set it as an exclusion criterion, which is an electronic checkbox in this case. We have the risk of disclosing information that can put subjects or other people, right? We have legal liability going on. Absolutely. Okay, so we're identifying some of these possible risks, right? Okay, and then, and this is the hard part, I admit, then you as an IRB have to try to estimate the probability, how likely, or the magnitude, how severe that potential harm might be that could result from those risks, right? That's hard, right? There's no doubt about it. This is hard. This is a tough thing that the IRBs have to do.
It's for you.
It's for me. I think it's for me. It's Yvonne calling. That's my boss. All right. So, and once you try to estimate the probability and magnitude of the risk, then you have to compare that risk to risk of daily life and these kind of normal examinations. Okay. This is obviously a very murky, fuzzy thing that IRBs have to do, but this is the process of making a minimal risk determination. Okay. So you have to think about those risks and try to assess amongst yourselves whether you feel like it's above minimal risk. Okay? Now, for an expedited review procedure, who in your IRB can do that? Who can do the expedited review of a protocol? The IRB chair, the Human Research Compliance Office as designated by the IRB chair, the experienced IRB administrator member designated by the chair, A and C, or all of the above. Okay. Whoops. All right, 60% of you say A and C. Right on. Totally agree. A and C. So either the chair can do it or an experienced member of the IRB designated by the chair. Okay. Those are your two options here. They can conduct an expedited review. You'll notice I'm not out and out answering the question of can we do this expedited, right? Because that would involve getting into a really in-depth that estimating thing, which we're not going to take the time to do right now. So let me go ahead and acknowledge that in case you're hanging on by a thread. But we're not completing that analysis, so I can't answer that definitively. Okay?
Is
That's okay.
that guidance from OHRP? Because in our policy at the medical center that I work for, that would never fly. The IRB chair is the one that's responsible to approve any expedited reviews.
Mm-hmm.
And so I go by our policy, but I mean, we always acknowledge the guidance that we get from the FDA, from OHRP, but can you maybe cite where that would
So this
be?
is actually a regulatory requirement. This is actually in the regulations. You have the book in front of you. So it's under, Ivor, do you happen to know the citation off the top of your head? But I can get to it fairly quickly. But I will, that's who can do it. I will say an institution can always make more restrictive policies, which yours would be to say chair only. And so that's perfectly acceptable.
Because notice that if what you're doing is your IRB chair is not designating anybody else to do expedited review, that's exactly what the regulation requires, right? So I think what you're doing is perfectly consistent with the regulation. It's just saying, well, for our institutional purposes, our IRB chair is not going to designate anybody else beside themselves. So I don't see a problem.
Okay. Yeah, it was just my question on where that was cited. I mean, because that's something that I think we should maybe implement, you know, because the IRB chair is not always available. So it's
I can tell you where it is. If you go, it's on page 6 of the regs book that you have in the right-hand column. So we're in section 109. Oh, no, excuse me. We're in section 110B. Okay, so under the enumerated 1 and 2, it says, under the expedited review procedure, the review may be carried out by the IRB chairperson or by one or more experienced reviewer designated by the chairperson from among members.
And just to put one more wrinkle on it, notice that if you were concerned about being at an institution where the IRB chair isn't available all the time, and maybe the IRB members aren't that readily available, one strategy that a lot of institutions do for precise to deal with this problem specifically is they do add someone from the research compliance office or from the human protections office. They make them a member of the IRB so that the IRB chair can turn around and say, you can do these reviews, and that's great because you're always at work. And you never take days off. And you're never sick.
So and to Ivor's point, the only reason B doesn't work in this case is because they're not an IRB member. Right? It's not the fact that it's a compliance officer, right? That, as he's pointing out, if they were also made an IRB member, then they could be the person. Okay. I will also say from what I just read, the other little word that I would just highlight out of that is an experienced member. So you want to avoid the situation where it goes to the newest one on the board because they get to do more work, but without that experience, having them do this, right? So you want to avoid that, not okay. It's got to be an experienced member. Okay. All right, continuing, talking briefly about expedited review. Next question. For an expedited review, which of these decisions can the expedited reviewer make? They can approve the research, they can defer the research, they can disapprove the research, A and B, or all of the above. up there? Okay. So we're split a little more leaning towards all of the above, although a good number still say A and B. And the correct answer here is A and B. So in expedited review, you can approve research or defer the research. However, it takes the full board to disapprove. So you would need, if you felt strongly it needed to be disapproved, it would have to go to full board. Okay. So that's some procedural questions about expedited review. So I will reminding that the criterion for review and approval of research is the same whether it is full board or expedited review, which is why I don't feel pressured to actually decide on this study if we could expedite it. Right. What we want to focus on at this point is the criteria to approve. Okay, that have to be met. So what you'll see in the box on the left are the criteria that have to be met in order to approve the research. Risks are minimized. Risks are reasonable in relation to benefit. Selection of subjects is equitable. Informed consent is sought from each subject, and informed consent is appropriately documented. Okay, and then there are some additional ones that, when they are appropriate, data collection is monitored for subject safety, subject privacy and confidentiality are protected, and additional safeguards are included for vulnerable populations. So in this case, you'll notice I bolded just one of those when appropriate criterion, because you guys have already raised there are issues here with privacy and then confidentiality of the information. Okay, so I think that one I've left bolded and grayed the other two because for this particular study, I think one of those when appropriate criterion is important. So in this case, you would need to meet all of those on the left plus the one on the right. Okay? All right, now is when I'm going to really put you to work. I've pulled out three topics here, and I want you guys to dig into these a little bit more deeply. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of time on each. I'm going to divide this up into 3 sections, and I'm going to ask you to discuss it among your table. You might want to find people that you want to. And so if you so discuss it amongst your table, and then I'll bring you back, and I'm going to let you guys bring it out as a discussion, and I'll just moderate at that point. Okay, so we're going to kind of hit these one at a time. So topic 1, revolving around risks. What are the risks? Are they no more than minimal risk? Have they been minimized? And is the risk-benefit ratio reasonable? So let me give you 5 minutes. We'll keep these relatively short, but I want to work through them one by one. So 5 minutes. Talk amongst yourselves. That's bad. I'm putting my own colleagues on.
It says if you have those rules,
The head of Missouri
potential for trauma.
Yeah, even if that would
Damage.
region plus IRB member, had a scientist with CRCAIH, kinds of stuff. That was a terrible geneticist, kinds of teacher, Okay, so what are we doing? The same protocol?
Yeah.
Group focus.
Identifying where as a perpetrator.
What are the risks? We kind of talked about that a little bit.
I was thinking of gender.
Yeah, I agree. And then have they been
Might be able to get something. I'm not buying it.
Be an online thing?
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, but so I'm not talking. I'd say in the chat room. Yeah, but on the back side, when they talk about
Yeah, I think it's an active like.
I think it's on. It's online. It's a virtual focus group, so they're all together.
So like one person will say something, the second person will follow, and the third, and it's like, yeah, it follows the thread.
She just wanted, are there no more than, or were they no more than?
Possibly both. One that was a solo back.
Are we just answering questions?
No, go ahead and talk about all of them, and then we'll, because we're going to do this in 3 rounds. We'll just do 3 rounds of this. Kind of already answered, so I know a fair amount, but well.
Timelines for the study, are they going to single out as well people who have
I'm thinking about like early psych classes where they talk about like bystander, I don't know what they call it, or like group things where if a lot of people witness a crime and nobody speaks up, then everybody stays silent because you're aware that other people are also watching. The likelihood of people staying silent is pretty high just because of like group psychology. And so like, having interventions about what would encourage that one person to speak up, and then everybody else will jump in. But once everyone's aware that there are other people there, everyone's they'll jump on the bandwagon of what other people are doing.
Oh, I just saw some abstract, yada yada, but I don't think they're considering. Yeah, so yeah, you're right. So that's even if people would know, but maybe that's not or she said because I will record the version. Yeah. You also maybe clarification on what that meant. But that would be a question you'd want to ask the investigator. Yep.
But they don't, really, what they don't do is it's a thread or it's like a Skype.
Voice thing, like purposely.
Okay, you guys ready for me to pull you back? I'm going to try to keep us moving a little bit here. Okay, Angela, I'm going to ask you to be my mic delivery mechanism. And I'm going to send you to this table right over here that I haven't heard a lot of today, just on the other side of that post. We've got a nice crowded table. There's good discussion going on over there. So pick your, who's willing to speak up and tell us what you think. What did the group decide?
So we kind of talked about a couple different things. They weren't real clear in the protocol if the discussion chat room things were real time. And if they were real time, we had some real concerns about the controllability of that in terms of if someone slipped and mentioned something identifiable, that you'd have no way to interfere and stop that. And then we just talked about some legal ramifications. If anything was disclosed in that chat room that would have legal ramifications, that would be a beyond minimal risk.
Okay. Do you feel that the risks have been minimized? Even if not minimal, have they been minimized?
No.
How about you guys over here? Sorry, Angela. I didn't think you walked enough yesterday. That 18-mile loop was not an... What do you guys think? Have the investigators minimized risks?
I think we decided that they hadn't. But we're all from small tribal communities, so risk benefit is, that's going to be one of our primary concerns always, is the ability to figure out who people are, regardless of the safeguards, using the internet, whatever.
I agree. I think in this case. So what else could they do? How could they minimize the risks further? Even if not getting them to minimal, because research that is not minimal risk can move forward, right? But there's an obligation to minimize the risks. Anyone want to jump in here? Here we go.
With the studies I oversee, they don't have them assign fake names. They assign them a number. We have subject. I work for North Memorial Medical Center. It would be North Memorial Medical Center 05023 is one of them. I think not giving them the option.
I wonder.
Not giving them the option.
You know what?
It's under those
Oh, it's
is it
Yeah,
because
one
of
of those
these?
speakers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, use your teacher voice.
So not giving them the option to
Uh-huh.
assign themselves a name,
Mhm.
I think would minimize their risk significantly. I mean, there's other things that they need to work out, but
Right. So taking away their ability to make up their own name, giving them an assigned identifier would help to minimize some of these risks, I'm hearing. Yes, what else?
They could offer resources or access to resources or referrals that would help people process the difficult content that they were hearing.
Absolutely. Being prepared to handle something that might arise that might be hard to handle, right? Okay. What else? Anything about the legal impacts here? Any suggestions for that? Maybe a COC? Maybe? Depends a little bit on how much of an impact you think that might actually be, but a certificate of confidentiality, maybe. It's a possibility at least. You already brought up the required reporting requirements. I think that alerting them to that, things like that, would also certainly help. And what about the risk-benefit ratio? We've been focusing on risk. You've been telling me about risk. We've been talking about minimizing risk. Risk-to-benefit ratio here. I haven't even heard the word benefit come up yet. What do you think? First of all, what do you think of the benefits listed in this study?
Skimpy.
Are they good? Is that true? Is that a benefit? What they say? Maybe arguable. They might be stretching it a bit.
Bystander intervention is a huge focus on university campuses, so I think there is benefit to this study.
So is that benefit to the participants in the study, or is that potential benefit of the work down the road?
The work down the road.
The work down the road. So there's a worthy reason to do this study, is what I'm hearing. There's potential benefit to the larger community down the road, but not necessarily to the individual, the subjects. Right. Is there a way they could possibly have a benefit here to individual subjects? You know, I think hearing what was said over here, the idea that you could have resources available, right? You could provide resources afterwards for that about learning more about sexual assault, or that sort of thing. That you could provide links to resources for help should something come up in the study. That could be a potential benefit for some subjects, not for all.
And training for, like, if you were a bystander and observed this, like, what would be a safe way for you to intervene in this situation, or what kind of action you could take if you were a bystander and witnessed this?
Absolutely, a potential training afterwards for what one might do.
It sounds like the videos might be of some benefit to the people that are participating. They might learn something by watching the videos.
Okay, possible. So do we feel in general like there might be the ratio of risk to benefits might be reasonable here? Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Yes.
Before you go on, one of the things that bothers me is that when you have a question that, in terms of participation, that if you've ever experienced any sexual assault or harassment, then you're going to not participate. Given that you have a body of 2,000 people, that could really skew your participants.
So that's an excellent point. So you might have a design issue here, given that you've got a smaller population you're drawing from, and that could. That's an excellent point.
And in terms of even just the risk to those that I don't know, it just really seems like it could potentially skew the results.
I think that's
the application.
I think that's a very good point. Okay. All right. So just a quick reminder: these are just some examples that I'm just going to throw up here. When it comes to minimizing risk, which we've just talked about, there are lots and lots of points to consider, and you guys raised a lot of really good points. A few we hadn't even thought of in discussing this ahead of time. There are a few others that I would raise, things like maintaining and storing the data, sharing records, destroying records, eventually that sort of plan, which this protocol doesn't say anything about for the IRB. That would be helpful to provide, right? How, as far as the risk of disclosure of outside of the research, that sort of thing, that could be raised here. More information given on empirical review, a review of empirical evidence in other studies? What's the likelihood that this could come up and that this risk could, would be bigger than the other, that sort of thing. Plans to handle foreseeable risks, that definitely came up. So a lot of different possibilities. This is not an exhaustive list in any stretch. Okay, next topic that I want you all to discuss is privacy and confidentiality adequately protected? So that's a risk we didn't dig into much in that past conversation. It's like you guys saw this coming. I love it. So now I'm going to give you a few minutes to talk about this. So please discuss this among your table.
We did talk about it. Yeah.
We're good. Covered it already.
This one seems to be a sketchy topic.
Do they have a moderator that
That's what they're telling me because I wasn't like. I don't think it's proximity to this mic because it was also happening there. So.
May not know.
I had a good idea about not having them on their fake names.
They have to have an outline.
We have this checkbox.
You know how we have to look for? Yeah, how are they going to check the?
Right.
Yes, specifically. And I didn't see that in actually.
But if it's like
Everybody knows, but
For them, like, background stuff that they might have.
Privacy is a personal
information. Not being able to share it. Not being, because some of these kids are little tiny kids and it starts.
They were logging in. People potentially share the login information with other friends, and then they just don't talk about their other like.
As sexual assault because it might just prove it out.
Yeah, and
I never thought of it. But that's what you
okay, that's okay.
Yeah.
One login and password, everybody can go interact.
Yeah, it's gonna have to be
So that no control.
It doesn't talk about that. It's just, that's what's.
As a moderator, you can't tell. Well, maybe there's a way they can tell the number.
Is the privacy and confidentiality adequate? No. Easy answer. You don't see anything.
And then, like, if that's a lesson, I have a laptop. We can just look at it with one login. Yeah, this web-based stuff is really hard when it's like.
Okay, I'm going to draw you guys back in. I'm going to make this one fairly short because it was a singular question, and I'm going to bring my far right table over here, my three ladies in the corner, and ask you guys to help me with this one. So what do you guys think? Is the privacy and confidentiality of subjects adequately protected in this protocol?
It would be. No.
No. Okay, so what would it take? What's the problem with it, and what would it take? Do you think? What's the major flaw?
Well, the only thing they addressed was the username, and there are other things that can tie, that you can use to find the identity of an individual. So all of the comments would be identifiable to the fake username, but you've got IP addresses, you've got all sorts of ways that you could identify that.
Absolutely. So having addressed only the username here primarily, I'm just repeating so that everyone over here, since we're having a problem with the mic, that there are many other things that are not addressed. IP address, the comments themselves being identifiable even to the fake name. Okay. What about all that demographic information that was gathered in the beginning? Does that ring a bell for anybody? I mean, not ring a bell, but does that raise a flag for anybody?
It's a huge flag. We talked about how if myself, there's a population of 2,000 people, and if I identify as being gay and I'm in a sorority, I'm most likely people are going to know who I am,
Absolutely. And does it give any indication of how that will be used by the researcher?
No.
Or whether it will be used by the researcher?
No.
Right. All it tells us is that the focus groups will be assigned based on gender. Right? So, and the fact that it's based on gender tells us that they're using at least a little bit of that information, right? Mm-hmm. So they have at least one piece of that demographic information to form the focus groups. Yes, sir.
If this is an audio, I hate to say it, but somebody from New Jersey is going to stick out in a university anywhere up here.
It's an excellent point. If it's audio, and it's unclear to us, right, the kind of recording that's going on, it's a little unclear from this protocol, right? There's a lot that's not said in this protocol, right? There's a lot that's unclear here. And you guys have raised a lot of the questions, things that would need to be protected. In our talks about risk, you raised lots and lots of things that don't appear to be completely addressed here. So I think this group is absolutely right. The answer to this question is certainly no. It's not done. Right? They're not completely protected here. And so that would be an issue. There's a lack of clarity in general in this space. Okay, so when you're thinking about privacy and confidentiality, things to look at as the IRB is to look at recruitment procedures. So you honed in on this a few times. It's a small group, 2,000, not a big number in these universities, and especially when you throw in the demographics, what measures can be put in place for these protections, study settings, how data is being collected to this point of whether there's audio or not, and how can that data be, the confidentiality of the data be protected in addition to the privacy of the subjects, right? What kind of data, how sensitive they are. Might want to raise the question of a COC, right? As we've talked about, there could be legal ramifications here. And then I kind of grayed out the bottom one here. It applies to some studies, although I think not here. Sometimes a waiver of documentation of informed consent can be used to protect confidentiality, as you know, whether if participating in a study could in itself raise a risk. It's not true for this protocol, but I just want to say it because it should be in your mind somewhere. Sometimes that's something that can be done to help protect the privacy and confidentiality a little bit. Okay, third topic I would like for you all to discuss, and that is one that has not come up, I think, a single time in this discussion, and I'm a little surprised, but that is informed consent. So I want you to talk in your tables about informed consent. Has informed consent been obtained and documented appropriately here? Go.
Just under 4.1.
Students will visit the study website to learn more about the study. Students volunteer for the knowledge and guided instructions, practices, and virtual We've acknowledged that we're the ones that come. It will be fairly entertaining. We have a college and do not have a history of being
but the process is and
it looks like the informed consent instructions about how to go about it.
Just
Tell them what the risks and
this is an implied consent.
We certainly don't see that all the elements of informed consent are in this
Exactly.
process.
Which, right. So if you do an implied consent, you need a waiver of consent. It's okay that you get the waiver of consent, documentation, and authorization, and then you can provide implied consent verbiage. Like when you're doing a survey, if you want to do a survey, you should put in their implied consent. If you take this survey, you're saying you're okay with us gathering that information.
Well, and they may say that it says it will be clearly in. Go ahead.
That little piece of paper.
They should, yes. We don't know. They don't give us enough information.
No, implied consent does not have to have all of those.
But it is implied consent.
Yes.
Implied consent.
I mean, even though it says it here.
Now they put it on
What
there,
if
the
they
category
say
of
I
informed
consent?
consent.
If they say I consent, that's in there. And that's not a deal. That's all they say.
To sign up for Facebook.
Some people have affecting some of the stuff too.
Right. The more small, the fine print.
Because they want them to receive it.
So we're in agreement that this, even though they have it under informed consent segment of their protocol,
We think it's implied.
they're using the implied consent process, which means they need a waiver.
Again, implied consent is not informed consent.
I would be in the interview. They need to have something.
Some of the
You either
things
do
that
the
they talk
informed consent process,
like your IP.
or you do the
That's
implied
what-
consent because you have the waiver of
Jump right to that
waiver
instead
of
of
consent.
like so they're losing a lot by
You're lacking.
excluding people who maybe
They have to make up their mind.
computer
If you're going to do implied
They would
consent,
have a
you're
really
going
good
to actually
perspective
do
on
informed
recognizing what harassment looks like as opposed to someone who's never experienced it and eliminating. I know maybe different right, but eliminating that.
No, you just have to have actually have the actual. We have a percent.
They want to complicate it, yeah.
We have an
And then they'll be
SOP
like,
that gives
see
the
where it
actual verbiage that
have
helps
psychological,
from.
emotional trauma. And
Because
it's
we copy and paste it. If you use this on your surveys, then that is an implied consent.
It's hard to
So
define.
it's very minimal.
Okay, you guys ready to talk about informed consent? Okay, so in general, has informed consent been obtained and documented? No, it has not. That's one of our big approval criterion, isn't it? So we've got a pretty big problem here when it comes to this. We've got to click through in this, right? Click this button to move on, and by the way, you've consented to participate in this research. Okay, which is probably not sufficient, especially because we haven't seen. Right, it says in here that it'll provide information about the study. It doesn't tell us what. And certainly the IRB, in this case, us in this room, do not have the information in front of us with which to determine whether we're meeting the requirements, right? So, points to consider as we think about informed consent here. First of all, of course, it's required, right? This is written pretty clearly in the regs. No investigator may involve a human being as a subject of research unless there is legally effective informed consent of the subject or the subject's legally authorized representative. Okay? So we have to ask ourselves, are the required elements addressed, right? Is that informed consent appropriately documented? And what is the acceptability of e-consent? So let's kind of look at those briefly here. So the required elements of informed consent. Now, as a quick reminder, this is the current regs. Okay, so this does not have the additional ones that came up earlier in Ivor's talk, where he talked about there are some new ones. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, right? You have to say this is research, and you have to describe the research. Talk about the purpose of it, duration, the procedures that's going, what that they can expect, right? Has to identify the risks, right? Any possible discomforts and list benefits, if any, right? List any alternatives, if any. In this case, that's not so much the case, but for other kinds of research, it would be. You have to discuss confidentiality and talk about that. And then compensation for injury. Again, I've not bolded that here. It doesn't seem to apply to this study. Whom to contact if you have questions. And then, of course, noting the voluntariness. They did note the voluntariness. I'll give them that. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Would you talk about implied consent?
Would I talk about it? So yes, but give me more, please.
They're asking, this is an implied consent, is it not?
Yes, but it is not a fully informed consent.
Right. Uh-huh.
Yes. Okay. I think that's correct. This is agreeing to something. I'm really enjoying the expression on Ivor's face, and so I'm going to ask Angela to hand him the mic because that usually means there's something good coming out.
I don't need the mic.
You don't need the mic.
I haven't heard what you mean by implied consent yet, so I don't know how to answer the question.
Yeah.
We thought that this was more of an implied consent, and yet they left out the fact that they did not request a waiver of consent. What you're saying is there's no such thing as implied consent. What?
Well, I don't know, because I don't know what you mean by when you say we thought that this was implied consent.
But we said,
why do you think it's implied consent as opposed to not implied consent?
Clearly indicated to participants that by proceeding with the survey, they have acknowledged that they do not have a history of being a victim or perpetrator of sexual misconduct and that they give their voluntary consent to participate in the study. So implied consent tells them that if you go ahead with the survey, you agree that you've consented. Is that not implied consent?
Okay. Yes, I think I would say that was implied consent. But where I thought you might be going but apparently you're not, is there are a lot of people who consider implied consent to be the same thing as what's often called passive consent, where you say, I'm going to talk to you about my favorite movies unless you stop me, right? And that's said to be consent. It's passive consent. And is there ever passive consent that is considered to be the same thing as informed consent under the regulations?
No.
And by and large, we have said, no, if we're talking about active versus passive consent, only active consent counts as informed consent under the regulations. And so in this instance, this would be implied and active consent because the person does actively proceed to start answering the questions, presuming that they're not a sexual abuser or whatever it was that they're saying, if you continue, you're not one of those. But I wasn't sure whether implied consent was being considered synonymous to passive consent or active consent in a particular way. So now I'm...
The other question we ask is, are there criteria for implied consent? I mean, we know there is for informed consent, but are there any criteria you have to meet to...
So the question there is, are there criteria for implied consent?
They would have to meet the criteria for active informed consent.
Right.
So it would have to be implied consent of an active sort, which my example was not, right? Where if I said, I'm going to talk to you about my favorite movies from now on, unless you stop me, and you just sat still, right? That's implied consent, but it's not active consent, and so it wouldn't be acceptable.
So, and in this particular case, we don't have evidence in the protocol in front of you that this is taken care of, right? And we don't have anything from the investigator in what's in front of you about requesting modification of the informed consent elements, right? And so they're not asking for any of that, which tells us that it should all be there, right? They're not looking to waive, or at least they haven't indicated that they're looking to waive informed consent or waive any elements of informed consent, or even, to some degree, documentation. Those things are possible. It's not indicated in this protocol, okay? But raising that's a way. So it's not that you could never do a click-through and provide information, but that has to all go through the IRB, which is not happening in this particular scenario. So moving from the elements of informed consent to documentation of informed consent, because both of those things are required, right? And then written into the regulations are ways to waive either of those things. So of course, that informed consent must be documented, right? IRB has to go through it, and then there's proper documentation. Has to be, the required elements have to be shown to be present, approved by the IRB, and then signed by the subject or LAR for full documentation unless it is waived. Okay? So just saying this, bringing this up really, really quickly, documentation of informed consent can be waived under certain circumstances, only two specific sets of circumstances, right? And that is if that informed consent document is the only thing linking the subject to the research and that's a potential risk, right? Which I don't think is true in this study. Okay, this is not true in this situation, and we've got to be at a minimal risk situation here. Okay, and just pointing out that waiving documentation of informed consent is not the same thing as waiving informed consent. So you can waive documentation, but you must still provide all of those required elements. Okay, and so that could be a case where it's noticed. You get all of this information, right? But you don't necessarily have the written signed thing at the end. That's waiving documentation, but you're still given all of the information that are in the required elements and the additional elements as necessary for that protocol. Yes, ma'am.
Well, legally, you can't get documentation on this study as it stands anyway, because they're using a fake name. So whatever fake name they write down on that document, if there was one, wouldn't be legal.
So it's the way that it's structured, that's true. In order to have actually gotten informed consent, that would have to be another thing up front that could be done before perhaps providing, say, the demographic information. Could be done and would need to be separated, and that would all have to be laid out as part of their privacy and confidentiality plan. You're absolutely correct. But the way it is structured now, it's not possible. It doesn't fit in there. And it's absolutely correct. Now, since we're talking about an online system here, let's go ahead and talk briefly about electronic signatures, because this clearly is becoming a bigger proposition, a bigger issue. I'm assuming you're seeing this more and more. We are hearing that people are seeing this more and more, so let's talk briefly about it. So here is what OHRP has said. So the regulations say what they say. They were written in 91. Electronic signature is not a thing right then. However, we have guidance on this, and which is to say that electronic signatures are allowable if, there are a couple of things here. So, and the big first one here, and that is if it's legally valid in your jurisdiction. Okay, so this is something that's going to vary by jurisdiction, by state, right? The laws are different. So this is a case where the IRB is going to have to be up on the local jurisdiction of where the research will take place, okay, whether it's their locality or not. Okay, but OHRP is fine with it as long as it's fine by those laws. And OHRP has not specified what methods of electronic consent or electronic signature are valuable or not valuable, are valid. That's what I'm going for there. Valid. All right. IRBs can agree to whatever technologies as long as you know how it's being created, can it be validated, that sort of thing. There are different electronic ways to do this, but it's important that the IRB kind of evaluate those and make sure that they can be validated and that a hard copy can be produced for the documentation for the subject to have in the end. Okay, this is not satisfied in the current protocol, but could it be? Possibly, it could be with a different setup. Okay. Okay, so, good job. That was fun. Now I want to jump back. We've been talking about the current regs for this, and I want to just quickly point out for this particular protocol, what might change if we were looking at this under the revised common rule. So Ivor and Angela have walked you through a lot about the revised common rule, so you've received kind of a primer on it today. I know it's a lot of information that has been thrown out at you, but just to review it kind of quickly here, and I'll reiterate. Feel free to jump in at any point, Ivor and Angela, if you would like to add anything. Okay. So first of all, the list of exemptions. Right. We started off, right off the bat talking about Exemption 2. We currently have 6, right? And we talked about Exemption 2 for this particular protocol. As you know, that list is changing. It is going to a list of 8 exemptions, and you've already seen this slide from Angela, how everything is changing. Exemption 2 is still probably what we would be looking at for the most part here. In this, however, I would also say we might actually be caught up in 3. So what you'll remember about Exemption 2 from Angela's talk is while there were a lot of similarities, it was expanded a little bit, but there was also another word thrown in there, and that was that pesky little only. Remember, she gave you that tricky question on it, right? I know you remember the tricky question. And that only, right? Yeah. So that only makes a big difference. So, but it's possible sometimes that you can, a research protocol could be exempt using 2 exemptions, as long as everything is covered in those 2. That can happen sometimes. So it's possible here that we could be looking at 2 and 3. So looking at the revised rule, Exemption 2, which of course is expanded, research that only includes interactions involving educational tests, surveys, interviews, and observations of public behavior, can be exempt when, right? Information is not identifiable, whatever is reported cannot be linked back to subjects, or doesn't have the potential to cause harm. Noticing here that the and has switched to the ors, right? Those joinders in the regulatory language will get you every single time, and they make all the difference. Or that if you're collecting identifiable information that also might be sensitive or has the potential to cause harm, that you go through the limited IRB review for approval of your privacy and confidentiality safeguards. And given that it's gone through that review and been approved, it could still be exempt under E2, the new E2. Okay? You guys raised the issue, though, that we also had an intervention, right? So we didn't just have the interactions with the surveys and interviews, but we had this intervention that we talked about a little bit with the videos. So under the new rules, right, if you were just talking about E2, that intervention, right, would kick you out. You could not be exempt under the new Exemption 2 alone with the behavioral intervention because of that only. Okay? However, could that behavioral intervention be considered a benign behavioral intervention? This is something your IRB would have to think about. This is not a question I'm going to answer for you right now. This would actually be kind of murky if you start thinking about it. And so, could it actually, be benign? You've got the same 3 criterions here, remembering what it meant to be benign, right? It seems like a very specific definition, but it's still kind of fuzzy. There's some wiggle room in here, as Ivor pointed out. Brief in duration, harmless, painless, not physically invasive, not likely to have significant adverse lasting impact on the subjects. I heard from a few of you that there's worry about that, bringing up potential memories or emotional, impact of previous trauma on someone else, and relating stories and this sort of thing. So there are lots of things to think about. This is not a yes or no question for now. This is something that IRBs will need to think a lot about when they're applying this new version of the rule, and could this actually be considered a benign behavioral intervention? So you saw us move from the pretty straightforward flow chart on through to this one, which is only slightly more complicated, really only on the right-hand side over there in the yellow, where we have some of the exemptions, right? We have a couple of additional requirements with limited IRB review, but just to highlight the point that they can still be exemptions as long as that requirement is met. It goes through the limited IRB review, like in this case for the privacy and confidentiality, and makes it through that, is approved through that. Then it can be exempt. Okay, we got to talk briefly about the changes to informed consent. Would they have an impact here? They would, simply because there are some additional things, right? We have the reasonable person standard that Ivor talked about. So when developing the informed consent, which was of course utterly kind of missing from our protocol, but it would need to be addressed, right? The idea that the information would need to be put up and provided for the reasonable person to make their determination. If it's a lot of information, they would need to have this succinct, the important elements up front, in sufficient detail, organized and presented in such a way to facilitate understanding. There is, of course, one additional basic element, the notice about future uses of data or information, and then the additional elements that were brought in that Ivor talked about. I know I'm going through this kind of fast because I know you've already heard it, so wave at me, throw something at me if you need me to slow down. About possible commercial profit. Don't think that's, so things like this, the notice about clinically relevant, that's not applicable in this case. But these additional elements. The only thing I'll say about electronic consent is it's actually stated now in the revised rule. Where it's talking about informed consent, it specifically says that an e-signature is acceptable. So that's actually written in there now. If you have not seen it yet, I can tell you that it is in there in 117A. And then there's our normal disclaimer. So we're talking very generally about the new regulatory requirements in the new rule, but you can find, and if you would, I know you have the current rules in front of you. If you want the text of the new rules, you can get it from our website. From the OHRP's website, we have it. You can go to, we'll have on the front page a little button about the revised common rule, and you can go to it, you can download a PDF, and you can print it. So you can get it. Just because we haven't printed it yet doesn't mean it's not accessible. It's just that you have to kind of get to it that way. Thank you so much for participating in this session. I know this has been a long session. We actually have a few minutes, so if anyone has kind of general questions, it can pertain to this session. It can be any about this new stuff. You can throw questions at me, Angela, Ivor. I'll throw my colleagues under the bus here and say, I'll open up the floor to anything. What do you have? Questions? I see one up here. Yes.
So this kind of goes back to the very first presentation and about
come on up, eyebrows is coming your way.
The new language around tribal law stating that they have a process for research review. Can you talk a little bit about what implementation of that will look like in terms of, is there any mechanism being thought about that would allow a tribe to preemptively indicate that they have a tribal law or code on the books somewhere so that it's not a case-by-case research study basis? Like, how is that being discussed?
Come up here to the mic, please, so we can get this on recording, because I think this will be an important answer. Not to boss you around.
And just to provide some clarity around, we had a tribal consultation with NIH recently around one of their single IRB policies, and I asked about implementation in that setting, and I think the way I heard them discuss that was a little bit more loose in terms of tribal policies, not an official tribal law somewhere. So I'm just wondering what some clarity around that.
Yeah, I'll answer this, or I'll dodge the second one first, because I'm not a lawyer. The regulation refers to tribal law, right? But exactly what has the status of a tribal law, I think we need a lawyer for, in order to say what counted as that in the deliberative process of some tribal entity that makes policy decisions within that tribal jurisdiction. So for that one, I don't know the answer. I imagine there's some gray in there. With respect to the other, I think the answer is it remains to be seen how that's going to work. And part of what I was saying was to say that the 500 to 600 tribal organizations that now have this ability now need to think about how they would go about it, whether they would want to exercise this on a case-by-case basis or whether they would want to proceed otherwise. I don't know if it's still true, but I know that there was a time period during which the Navajo Nation had an across-the-board ban on research involving the Navajo Nation and DNA, right? So I think it is possible for an organization to make policy decisions that are not study-specific, but rather apply more generally, and that they may use whatever dissemination strategies they have available to them to make that known, right? And I think that they could either do it themselves, they could presumably work through some kind of intermediary entity, like they could try to get the Indian Health Service to spread the word. And there are also, the web is part of our lives. If you want to know about to give an example, if you want to know what the abuse requirements are for reporting on a state-by-state basis, what the standard of belief is, who is obliged to report, all that kind of stuff, there are websites that have collected for various people's information, state-by-state accounts of that kind of information, and it could happen that someone or entity will take it upon themselves to start identifying a website resource for where you can find all of the tribal provisions that are specific to various kinds of research studies. We'll see.
All right, unless there are other questions, I actually think that question was a perfect segue. We're going to have a little break right now, and then we're going to come back to our tribal IRB panel. So that was a perfect way to wrap this one up and get everybody primed and ready for the next session. So have a quick break, get up, have some more coffee, stretch, get a little sunshine, and we'll see you back here right at 3 o'clock. All right, thank you so much.